This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. I recently interviewed Chloe Taylor, who's one of the academic editors of the series, as well as Richard Twine, who is the author of a recent entry in the series called The Climate Crisis and Other Animals. If you missed those episodes, I encourage you to look back through our archives. On today's episode, however, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr Charlotte Wrigley, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Greenhouse Centre for Environmental Humanities at the University of Stavanger in Norway. She has a mixed academic background, but her PhD at Queen Mary University in London was in human geography. Her research expertise concerns the Arctic, extinction, and climate change. Today, we're going to talk about mammoths, and especially Charlotte's beautifully named book, Earth, Ice, Bone, Blood, Permafrost and Extinction in the Russian Arctic, which was released in 2023 by the University of Minnesota Press. Welcome to the podcast, Charlotte.
Thank you for inviting me. Happy to be here.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Yeah, and I actually remember it very clearly. I was doing my master's thesis on rewilding, so I was already interested in kind of these ideas of ecological restoration and species revival, moving animals around, etc. And then I came across this series of TED Talks, which was on de-extinction. And I'd never heard of this before. And the concept of it was absolutely wild to me because it seemed to be just a bunch of techno-optimist Silicon Valley people just really kind of extolling the virtues of using this science to fix the problem of extinction. And I don't know, I hadn't even thought about doing a PhD at that point, but from then on, I knew I kind of wanted to explore this in more detail. So that's why I ended up doing my PhD on de-extinction. Initially, I did want to do the topic on these kind of Silicon Valley companies, like Revive and Restore, I guess is one of the main ones, one of the early ones anyway. But they weren't replying to my emails, so I essentially had to do a little pivot. And that's how I came across Pleistocene Park, which was where I ended up doing my fieldwork in Arctic Russia, a rewilding project that is aiming to restore the mammoth ecosystem. And they're not fully involved in mammoth de-extinction, but obviously they're kind of tangentially related.
So this is very much a book about extinction, but I think it's fair to say that one of the takeaway messages from the book as a whole is that extinction is not a straightforward concept, and that we encounter literally or figuratively a range of different senses of extinction on the permafrost.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I spend the book across the 4 chapters thinking about extinction in a variety of ways. And it kind of follows the title, Earth, Ice, Bone, Blood, thinking about extinction on a kind of planetary scale, really thinking about the potential for human extinction, which I would argue projects like Pleistocene Park and other kind of geoengineering projects are attempting to address this very terrifying idea that humans may one day go extinct themselves. But then I kind of move on to think about extinction in, wider capacities, thinking about permafrost. Is permafrost something that can go extinct? The idea of kind of non-life extinction. And then I move into I guess more normative ideas of extinction. Species extinction, of course, is the main one, but how these boundaries are blurred by things like rewilding, bringing species that have been extinct from this particular ecosystem for a very long time, but bringing them back in order to try and resurrect a particular ecosystem. And then, of course, I guess the final boss of extinction is the reversal of it, which is what de-extinction proposes to do. But I mean, as I'm sure we will get on to further discussion about this and that you read in my book, it's really not as simple as resurrecting an animal and then having that be, you fix the extinction of that creature. So that's what I've been trying to do with the book, is to expand how we know extinction to be in these kind of normative forms, and think about it in, blurrier and weirder ways, I guess.
Yes, I definitely do want to get onto mammoths and that very visual, very kind of evocative form of de-extinction that you talk about at the end of the book. But I think first it's worth stressing, you talked about the Pleistocene Park and you mentioned permafrost. So I have a particular image in my head of what this looks like that might be shaped by, I don't know, science fiction films and video games. What is the permafrost, really? And what is this space that you're inhabiting and thinking about and talking about?
I guess one of the reasons I really wanted to do a PhD and write a book on permafrost is because it's just not really talked about, at least not until quite recently. If you imagine the Arctic, most people would think about, glaciers or snowy wastelands. And I mean, I have my own, bugbear with people who think that the Arctic is, empty and there's nothing going on. But then permafrost is a whole nother category in and of itself, because it doesn't look Arctic-y, really. It just looks like mud. And so I was really drawn to this quite boring, banal substance. And once I started to kind of delve deeper, I realized it was anything but banal. Then you go into the terrifying facts that permafrost is thawing, and it sequesters more than double the carbon that is currently in the atmosphere today. And as it thaws, this carbon gets released. And there's this whole kind of element of, as I go into the first chapter, this kind of apocalyptic scenario in which permafrost thaws and all of the carbon gets released, and that causes this tipping effect of climate breakdown, which we're kind of already in, of course. But yeah, so this kind of like imaginary of permafrost, I wanted to take it, I wanted to challenge it, I wanted to think more about it, and also to show how permafrost is not just one thing. It's not just the kind of scientific definition of it, which is permanently frozen ground for a period of 2 or more years, which is super vague and doesn't really capture what permafrost is at all. So I wanted to just show how permafrost can be so many things, and it's not going to stay as the thing that people think it might be. Like, the name permafrost is in and of itself, useless, because it isn't permanent, and it's certainly not staying permanent. So yeah, I just really wanted to place it and just demonstrate how it's just so many things and can be so many things to so many people, animals, and the like.
Let's turn to mammoths then. I suppose one of the really interesting things about your discussion of mammoths is that although mammoths are long extinct, whatever extinct means, they're still very much present in the Russian Arctic. They're still very much present in the permafrost, and not just as skeletons or fossils, but as bloody, meaty corpses.
Yes, exactly. And I didn't get to research this in as greater depth as I wanted to, just by way of geography. It's very difficult to get to these places. I was incredibly lucky to go to Pleistocene Park for fieldwork, but there's this whole other kind of mammoth economy that is happening in conjunction with thawing permafrost, which is that, as you say, these fleshy mammoth bodies that, honestly, like, if some of them are so well preserved that it just looks like they're asleep. And there are all sorts of stories of people finding these mammoths. One guy who I interviewed, the head of the Mammoth Museum in Yakutsk, he actually sliced off a piece of the mammoth he found and ate it, just to kind of show how fresh this thing was, which, honestly, that's so Russian. Finding these mammoths is, of course, also finding their skeletons and also, of course, their tusks. There's this whole kind of black market economy that has sprung up alongside thawing permafrost, which people find the mammoths. They will sell the tusks, because you can sell the tusks to make a lot of money, because it's ivory. It's, people will always want ivory for some reason. And so this is happening. And if you're finding like well-preserved mammoth bodies, there's also this option of de-extinction scientists who also want this. So you have this kind of interesting tandem scenario of people wanting to find the tusks, but also finding the bodies, which are also wanted by the scientists. And it's a kind of like circular thing going on.
Is there a cultural element to this as well then? Is there a sense in which the mammoths are really shaping how humans interact with the permafrost, how they see the permafrost, or is it more of just an economic matter?
That's a really interesting question, because The majority of the people who are hunting these mammoths are indigenous people. There are many indigenous groups in this area of Siberia, and a lot of them have cosmologies that have mammoths as playing a large role. Some view the mammoth as a kind of god. Some view mammoths as kind of aquatic beasts. But the people who I was talking to in these towns acknowledge that disturbing a mammoth body, if you come across one, is just not going to end well. So you have this quite brutal tension sometimes of people needing to make money, people needing to feed their family, and it's very difficult to live in these places, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, when you don't have this kind of job security. So it's understandable that people want to make a bit more money, but at the same time, if you are within these cosmologies that see mammoths as sacred, then you're essentially doing something that is very, very bad. So you have these situations in which sacred beads are left at the grave sites to kind of mitigate the bad luck that will befall you if you're picking up a mammoth body. But yeah, I think it would be extremely interesting, that history taken alongside the Pleistocene part, which wants to bring mammoths back to the land. I don't know if that will ever happen, but I can imagine some quite interesting and not great tensions between this kind of history and also the future of a resurrected mammoth.
Yes, I see what you mean. And I think it's really important to think about the interaction that these mammoths have with the people who are there. But I also think, and this is one of my favourite parts of your book, it's important to think about the mammoths themselves. And so I really loved your clear desire to recover the individuality of some of these mammoths that you encountered yourself or that other people encountered, and you spoke to those people. So a lot of these mammoths have names. So I remember Buttercup. I don't remember some of the Russian names because they didn't quite stick in my head in the way they might have stuck in your head. But I was really intrigued also to read how you tried to recapture the experiences of these particular mammoths in life, which of course might be easier given, as you say, how lifelike, how close to life some of these bodies seem.
Yeah, I think I was really struck by Buttercup in particular, because when I first encountered her, she was kind of hacked to pieces in a bag in a freezer. And even though, rationally, this is a long dead mammoth and can't feel anything, you still feel kind of desperately sorry for something that has been taken out of her resting place, essentially, and just used for this potential science. It's not even, something that will absolutely work, and even if it did, I wouldn't advocate for it anyway. But just as a kind of like laboratory specimen, her cells extracted, her body parts cut up and kind of like moved across the world in the hope that something will emerge from it. I think they discovered that she was a mother, and that raises all sorts of questions of, will Buttercup be a mother to another mammoth, just not in the kind of way that was her history, her story. So yeah, these mammoths, and I really wanted to talk about them as not as body parts, not as cells, not as representations of a species that we want to bring back for whatever reason, but creatures with a history. And I thought that was very important to do.
What do you think it is about mammoths? And of course, this might link to the ecological questions around things like the Pleistocene Park. What do you think it is about mammoths that makes them so attractive as candidates for de-extinction?
Yeah, I mean, it's the old story, isn't it? They're charismatic megafauna. If you look at the three main species that the main de-extinction company, Colossal, are looking to de-extinct, it's the ones that have the best stories. It's the mammoth, it's the thylacine, and it's the dodo. And the dodo makes the least sense ecologically, because there's absolutely no way you could establish a population on Mauritius, because the reason they went extinct in the first place was because of the rats and the cats that came from, the slave ships. For the mammoth, I mean, they at least try and say there's a kind of ecological benefit to bringing a mammoth back. And this is why it kind of made an appearance in my book, because the reason the Pleistocene Park exists is because they want to rewild an ecosystem where large herbivores trample down the permafrost and this will keep it frozen. So there's a kind of like ecological reason for them doing this. And of course, the mammoth is the biggest of the herbivores. So to kind of bring it back and place it into the Pleistocene park, there is an element of kind of ecological benefit, I guess. But you would need so many mammoths and we just don't have the time for that. So really, this whole project is very much a vanity one. And then you kind of get into the argument of, well, we made the mammoths extinct, then it's our moral obligation to bring them back, which again is really kind of shaky reasoning because we don't actually know if it was humans or it was the climate that made mammoths go extinct. But even if it was humans, the fact that we have this moral obligation, we also have a moral obligation to the animals that are alive right now on the planet. And this just seems to be a very kind of expensive way to just, kind of serve one species just for vanity reasons whilst ignoring a lot of the others.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think as well as these kind of moral questions that you've just raised, you've hinted at your skepticism about the science. So is your sense that really realistically we're not going to see the mammoth de-extincted? Is the science a long way from actualization now?
The thing is, it won't be a mammoth, and this is the kind of lie that they don't quite gloss over that fact, but they are certainly relying on like the charismatic vision, imaginary of the mammoth being enough for people to be, oh wow, we brought it back, we fulfilled a moral obligation, all the reasons I just went into. But it won't be a mammoth, it will be a hybrid, because you can't actually resurrect a mammoth. I mean, there's a whole kind of argument that you could find a viable cell that you could clone, but this is so unlikely. Even if mammoths are incredibly well preserved by permafrost, cells begin to degrade on the moment of death. There would just be no way that a mammoth would be flash frozen so quickly that you would be able to find a cell that was viable for cloning. So essentially, the science relies on hybridization using a gene editing software called CRISPR. So essentially, you isolate the parts of the mammoth gene that you want, the long hair, the cold-adapted blood, the small ears, essentially the things that make a mammoth look like a mammoth and are suited to living in colder temperatures. But then you'd use the Indian elephant, its genome, to produce an elephant essentially that looks like a mammoth. So you're creating a kind of Franken creature. This is a lot of the kind of ethical issues that people really don't like when they hear about this. It's the idea of playing God, but it's certainly not resurrecting a mammoth. Whether we will see a hybrid Indian elephant with mammoth features, I mean, Colossal are saying by 2028, but then again, they said by 2026 a few years ago, so it's getting later and later. I mean, but I wouldn't be surprised if we did see a mammoth-like creature by the end of this decade.
Is there a little bit of you that's excited at that prospect, or is it all the feeling of horror?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would have a lot more to write about, which doesn't mean I want it to happen. But in the context of if it's going to happen anyway, I want to be there to be able to write about it. And I hope that my work will go some way into making people think twice about this science being a kind of a viable thing to fix extinction. But yeah, the majority of my feelings of it are kind of horror.
I learnt a new word reading your book. What is cryopolitics?
Yeah, I mean, without going too deep into Michel Foucault, which I don't know how many people want to hear about that, but it's kind of a riff on biopolitics, which is a Foucauldian idea about like power and life and where power and life reside. So Foucault identified that life was kind of like being lived at the level of the population, and like institutions such as hospitals, schools, prisons, etc., all kind of exist to promote the health of populations, and in particular certain populations. And cryopolitics takes the idea of biopolitics one step further by introducing freezing to this. So essentially, let's see if I can get this right. make live and not allow to die. So it's this not allowed to die element that is really important when it comes to life at the level of kind of cellular material. And so we're seeing a real rise in cryobanking as a response to the extinction crisis, but also things like the possibility of seeds going extinct or agriculture failing. So you have places like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which stores, not all the seeds, but a lot of seeds, which are there as kind of backups in case crops fail, and countries can kind of request the seeds to restore their agriculture. So it's this idea of, warding off the inevitability of extinction, I think. If you have cellular material in a freezer, then you can argue that this creature is not extinct if you still have the cellular material, or even, in the case of the mammoth, like whole bodies or parts of bodies. So it's this idea that you can kind of pause life through the freezer in order to kind of like regenerate it later on.
But I do think you've raised a really interesting point there, in that there's potentially a very real sense in which mammoths are not extinct.
Exactly. And so it's really interesting tension between the fact that they are one of the most kind of famous examples of extinction and are one of the main candidates for de-extinction, yet the cellular material kind of endures in the freezer. And what kind of becomes of that is a really interesting question between these ideas around life, death, extinction, non-life, time.
Before I go on to the regular questions, let me finish with what I think is a very challenging question that I know you will have thought about. I think I'm right in saying that this book was completed around the time of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. In what ways do you think these events and the shifting geopolitical factors impact the permafrost and its human and indeed non-human inhabitants?
Yeah. I mean, I was living in Russia when the war broke out. I was working for a Russian institution, and I quit the next day and managed to get out reasonably easily. So I was lucky in that sense, but my whole research life up until that point had been on Russia, particularly the Russian Arctic. And, it doesn't stop being the Russian Arctic just because of the invasion of Ukraine. And it really, really worries me what is happening in the Russian Arctic now, partly because very few Western researchers or researchers in general are able to collaborate with Russian researchers or go to Russia to conduct fieldwork, but also just because Putin has made it very clear that the Arctic is a very big part of his agenda to kind of like, make Russia the greatest power in the world. He wants there to be an ice-free northeastern passageway on the Arctic Ocean for trade with China and the Far East. He's identified all sorts of minerals and resources in the Arctic. A lot of Russia's natural gas comes from the Arctic. So he really knows what he has, but a lot of those resources are not very accessible due to the permafrost. He wants the permafrost to thaw. It would be in Russia's interest, to his mind, if there wasn't as much permafrost. And his belief in the climate crisis has been very shaky at best. I don't think he really believes in it. So honestly, I don't see a kind of bright future in the context of the Russian Arctic, and unless something happens geopolitically to end the invasion, to end the war, to end Russia's aggression. But it makes me very sad because I don't want to stop talking about the Russian Arctic. I don't want to stop researching it. I met a lot of dedicated people while I was there who are fighting against, all the climate crisis, but also the government, the autocracy that is in place there. But yeah, as I said, I don't see anything positive at the moment happening in the Russian Arctic, unfortunately.
Now, Charlotte, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yep.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Donna Haraway's Teddy Bear Patriarchy. I think I read a little bit of other stuff like Peter Singer before that, but I think this was the first piece that kind of really brought it home to me, the kind of systems and practices that humans have placed to cement this kind of nature culture binary. And this article demonstrates how that's kind of literally the case, because it's about people going into museums and looking at animals behind in the glass cases. This one in particular is about the Natural History Museum in New York, the whole of Africa in particular, and looks into how the animals are killed and stuffed, and focusing on one person in particular, a white man called Carl Ackerley, who went to Africa, went on these kind of hunts and tried to find the peak specimens of African wildlife that he could bring back, which he would then arrange in particular poses and put in particular contexts, dioramas that are essentially constructions. These are invented constructions that create and perpetuate these kind of racist and colonial imaginaries of Africa. And the article really kind of wonderfully skewers this fantasy that the Natural History Diorama and the Natural History Museum, which has kind of been the way it's been for a very long time and still is in some museums, although that's changing quite a lot in a lot of places. But this idea that this natural history diorama is this place of learning and displaying animals accurately and scientifically, but actually, as Haraway says, it's just kind of a place to produce these particular forms of knowledges that are predicated on violence and suppression.
And can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yeah, that would be my master's thesis, which I did on Scottish wildcat conservation. The piece is now in Environmental Humanities, the journal, if people want to go and read it. But I was living in Scotland, I was at the University of Edinburgh, and I was really fascinated by the story of Scottish wildcat conservation, because what's happening with the wildcats is, well, no one really knows if they're extinct or not, or they're on the brink of extinction, but that was kind of like the line, and the reason is because they've been hybridizing with feral or domestic cats. So you had these conservation groups kind of fighting about what is it that we actually want to save with the wildcat, which kind of brings in all these questions about purity and native species. There was one group who wanted 75% pure genetic purity was okay with them. And then the other faction is like, absolutely not. 100% is the only thing we will accept. So there was all these like questions about, the romanticization of the wilderness, the Scottish identity, people wanting there to be this kind of purity, which is a problematic idea anyway to me. But in all of this, like, no one really stopped to think about what the cat wants. The cat is perfectly happy mating with a feral cat. He's having a great time, and it doesn't produce, you can produce cats that essentially still act like wildcats. They still look like wildcats, and it's actually very difficult to tell visually whether a wildcat is pure or not. So I kind of came to the conclusion to let them die, let them go. If this is what the cat wants, the cat is just, living his best life. So kind of quite a provocative thing to say, but I stand by it.
That is a topic we've addressed a few times on Knowing Animals, and I think it's such a fascinating one. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I wouldn't class myself as an animal studies scholar. I prefer to think about the more kind of like the broader environmental milieu of which animals are a part of. I've been influenced by a lot of animal studies scholars such as Haraway, Tom Van Doren, Deborah Bed-Rose, etc. But I went with someone who isn't considered an animal studies scholar but has written about animals, and that was Jacques Derrida and his cat in particular. And I kind of think about this famous scene of Derrida being naked in front of his cat whenever I meet my own cat getting out of the shower or something like that. And Derrida talks about how animals are all too often relegated as kind of non-individuals, as members of a species, as representatives of a species, as kind of genderless. They're often referred to as it, emotionless, feelingless, etc. And so kind of to imagine what his cat sees when he looks at Derrida and his nakedness and his shame is to flip the subject-object dichotomy around in really interesting ways, and kind of affords animals their own gaze, which I think is really important. And I'm currently reading Moby Dick, and whilst I would not classify that as a piece of animal rights literature, it's literally killing whales. But I do kind of appreciate how long the narrator, and it is a really long time, spends on kind of knowing whales in their own right. I just read a bit which discusses in great detail whale eyes and their vision and how they see totally differently to humans. And I think it's kind of quite rare to encounter this sort of depth and thinking when it comes to non-humans without straying into anthropomorphism.
We touched on this to a certain extent earlier, but what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I guess I don't see it so much as doing something for animals, but more about trying to underscore how humans and animals are kind of entangled planetary beings. And so I really think it's important to draw the links between animals and wider systems of power that exploit and use non-humans for both human exceptionalism and extractivism. And of course, I do think it's really important to advocate for non-humans in terms of rights and justice. But yeah, I'm kind of more concerned about illuminating the kind of enfolding of animals into systems that depend on their labor or their bodies in the kind of pursuit of capital or dominance, and how this has repercussions throughout a planet which, where we humans and animals are interconnected. And I guess I thought of an example from my own work into birds, particularly barnacle geese, which is avian influenza, and how bird flu is, well, it comes from the factory farming complex, which is then kind of spread into the wild bird population. And this was really awful for the barnacle geese because a few years ago, when there was a huge outbreak of bird flu, they lost a third of their population to the disease. We're now seeing a situation in which the disease is spreading to non-bird populations, cows in particular, again, links to the factory farming complex. And you're seeing, the cases that are emerging in humans as well. And so I think it's really important to show how killing, or culling as the word is in this situation, but it is killing, how it becomes kind of normalized in the face of these, epidemiological protections, or dictating where animals can be to shore up this idea, this fabricated barrier between us, the nature culture thing. And I'm not predicting that avian flu will be another COVID-19, although it certainly could be. But I think it is imperative that we as academics highlight these violent and often deadly practices that are obscured through extractive capitalism and human exceptionalism.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the obvious one that I'm sure a lot of people say is kind of the communication, if we could understand animals. So I thought a little deeper about it, and I think I'm going to go with that it would be really interesting to shift the relationship to make humans more often prey to other animals, because this is something that, we haven't experienced for a very long time. But I'm thinking particularly of the philosopher Val Plumwood's encounter with a crocodile, which tried to kill her and almost did kill her, and how that really destroyed, she used that encounter to destroy the notion of anthropocentrism and also the nature culture dualism. But I could also kind of bring it back to the mammoth. Of course, the mammoth isn't going to turn us into prey, but I do think it's interesting how there were kind of higher stakes when it comes to obtaining and eating other animals, back when the mammoths were around. And it's kind of debated how, important hunting mammoths were to hunter-gatherer societies, but for the purposes of this thought experiment, let's just go with the idea that they were, because there must have been a huge amount of work and effort and labor and preparation into hunting, tracking, preparing a mammoth, because of course there was a very real risk that you would get hurt doing so, either by the mammoth itself, or a stronger predator. And I'm not suggesting that we kind of return to a hunter-gatherer society, but I do think collapsing, that distance that exists now, and, re-engaging this kind of proximity that hunter-gatherer societies had to their food, where the decisions of, what and when to kill being incredibly important. Because now you just kind of go to the store and buy your chicken strips for your stir fry, and there's just this huge distance. And I kind of don't want to moralize what people should and shouldn't eat, but I do think if I had this power, I would want to kind of collapse these walls to make sure everyone had all the facts to really understand the process of what happens to kind of get their meat to the store in this easily packaged and separated format.
What are you working on next?
Yeah, something that probably doesn't involve a lot of animals. I'm working on a project called Good Fire, which is looking into fire ecologies in the Boreal North, which I want to turn into an ERC proposal about smouldering fires. Because smouldering fires, I guess it's kind of like the permafrost. It's something that has been ignored in favor of, the flaming fires get all the attention, just like the ice caps get all the attention, whereas smouldering fires haven't really been addressed, certainly not in the humanities, but they are firstly incredibly destructive to wildlife because they burn longer and slower. With a flaming fire, once it's out, and it usually burns much smaller areas. Smoldering fires can last for years, for even decades, and they cause huge amounts of harm to animals and also to humans. But it's also kind of bringing it into the permafrost as well, because there's this slightly terrifying phenomenon called a zombie fire, in which fires will smolder under the permafrost over the winter, completely kind of undetected, unseen, and then in the summer, the next summer will reignite at the surface again. So yeah, I really want to delve back into the Arctic, back into the permafrost, but thinking about it in kind of the context of fire.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I'm kind of slowly extracting myself from all forms of social media for reasons I'm sure a lot of people are. But I do have a website. It's www.charlottewrigley.com. So I am not very good at updating it, but there's a lot of stuff about my work and my contact details. So you're very welcome to email me to find out more.
Well, thanks so much, Charlotte, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can follow me on X or on Instagram @aveganphilosopher, and I'm also on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.